Today, we are taking a trip back in time over a century ago to explore a fascinating, flashy, and frankly, a little frightening period of American history known as the Gilded Age. But we aren't here to talk about bustles and railroads alone. We are diving deep into how people celebrated the spookiest night of the year, Halloween, Gilded Age style. The Gilded Age, roughly running between 1865 and 1902, was a time of immense and radical social change in the United States. It was an era of rapid economic growth, industrial boom, and soaring prosperity for some. However, it was also defined by staggering wealth inequality, massive labor exploitation, and political corruption. Think about the name itself, the Gilded Age. This era was named after Mark Twain's novel from 1873, The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. Twain gave the period this name because gilding is a technique where you apply a thin layer of gold over materials that are much cheaper, like wood, metal, or stone. Twain suggested that while the era looked dazzling and golden on the surface, that thin layer of glamour, it actually concealed a huge depth of poverty and injustice underneath. We need to understand this contrast to understand their Halloween. On one side, you had the glittery top, the wealthy elite. These were the industrialists, often called robber barons, who claimed huge pieces of the economic pie. Names like John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, and Andrew Carnegie. These men made fortunes in oil, railroads, steel, and finance. Pittsburgh, for example, became known as Steel City because of men like Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick. These newly rich, the nouveau rich, strived to emulate European royalty and aristocracy. They showed off their wealth by building magnificent, lavish mansions along places like Fifth Avenue in New York City. They also constructed over-the-top places they called summer cottages in Newport, Rhode Island. Their wives and daughters dominated high society, trying to one-up each other with ever more elaborate parties. These parties were all about excess, opulence, and being seen in the most sophisticated European style. And speaking of excess, their food was lavish. Their dinner parties often featured multiple courses of incredibly rich and heavy dishes. We're talking oysters, lobster, venison, roasted duck, and thick cuts of beef, all finished off with decadent desserts. The rich spared no expense, seeking out rare ingredients, fancy preparations, and imported delicacies. Exotic fruits that most Americans had never seen, like bananas and pineapples, graced their tables. Now, contrast that with the people below the thin gold veneer. The vast majority of people suffered in poor living conditions, working long, back-breaking hours just to keep their families afloat. The country had transformed from one based on farming to one centered around cities and factories. Millions of immigrants came to America, escaping unrest or famine in Europe. This constant supply of desperate people ensured that factory and mine owners had plenty of people willing to take miserable, low-paying jobs. In 1890, nearly 11 million of the 12 million families in the U.S. earned less than $1,200 a year. To support themselves, every member of the family who could work did. Children as young as 4 had to pull their weight. They worked in factories, where their tiny hands were useful for reaching into machinery. Or they worked in mines, where they could crawl into small tunnels. Standard shifts were often 12 hours long, and the work was crushingly boring. Accidents were frequent, often maiming or killing the children who fell asleep at the dangerous machinery. When these exhausted workers stumbled home, their off hours were just as bleak. In cities like New York, the poor lived in cramped tenement buildings, sometimes with dozens of people sharing a single apartment. Running water, sewage systems, and even windows were rare luxuries. The workers watched their employers throwing carefree, lavish parties in their mansions. This frustration naturally led to labor unions forming, demanding better conditions and higher wages, the ideal of 8 hours of labor, 8 hours of sleep, and 8 hours of leisure time. But owners suppressed these unions violently. The city of Pittsburgh saw one of the most infamous labor incidents of the era, the Homestead Strike in 1892. Workers picketed the Carnegie Steel Company building, keeping out strikebreakers. Henry Clay Frick, the chairman, hired 300 armed Pinkerton detectives to infiltrate the factory. A battle ensued, leaving many men killed or injured. So this is the world of the Gilded Age, a world of unimaginable sparkle and excess built upon a foundation of severe hardship and inequality. And into this world, the customs of Halloween, or All-Hallows Eve, firmly took root in America. The holiday itself has a history stretching back thousands of years to Europe. Its origins trace back to the Celts, who lived in Ireland, the United Kingdom, and parts of northern France. The Celts practiced a festival called Samhain, which marked the transition from autumn, a time of life and abundance, to the cold, dark, silent winter months. They held bonfires and religious rites. The Celts believed that during Samhain, the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead became blurred. Their ancestors, the dead, could actually return to walk the earth. To protect themselves and to hide from any unwanted spirits, the participants in this festival dressed up in animal skins and wore masks. When the Romans conquered the Celts, these traditions blended. The Romans held a similar festival called Feralia at the end of October to commemorate the dead. The holiday transformed again with the rise of Christianity. The Catholic Church instituted All Saints' Day, celebrated on November 1st to honor saints and Christian martyrs. As Christianity spread, Samhain and All Saints' Day blended into All Souls' Day, observed on November 2nd. This new holiday mixed the Celtic traditions of bonfires and parades with Christian imagery, such as angels, saints, and devils, which quickly became popular choices for costumes. This is where the name Halloween comes from. All Saints' Day was also known as All-Hallows. The night before, when the original festival of Samhain was observed, became known as All-Hallows Eve. Over time, as these three celebrations coalesced around the last day of October, the holiday we call Halloween was born. When Europeans first came to North America, they brought their traditions, including All-Hallows Eve. It wasn't immediately widespread, though. It was mainly observed in the southern British colonies as a way to celebrate the harvest with activities like storytelling, singing, dancing, and bonfires, much like the original Samhain. But everything changed in the mid-1800s. A fresh wave of Irish and Scottish immigrants arrived in American cities, often fleeing famine and unrest, bringing their old-world customs with them. Specifically, millions of Irish fleeing the potato famine of 1846 helped make Halloween an American tradition by the end of the 19th century, right in the middle of the Gilded Age. These Irish and Scottish Americans hosted parties and balls, sometimes including readings of Robert Burns' poem Halloween or the telling of Irish legends. They influenced their neighbors to join the fun of dressing up and going door to door, asking for money, food, and treats. By the Gilded Age, these ancient traditions were rapidly evolving into the modern customs we recognize today, but with a definite air of mischief and mayhem. Let's talk about the tricks. During this period, the older, more traditional methods of celebrating Halloween, such as honoring the dead or holding large bonfires, were increasingly replaced by pranks. This spirit of pranking, which often had decidedly mischievous overtones, was widespread across all classes of society. The trick in trick-or-treat owes its presence to a centuries-old history of jokes and pranks, perhaps referencing the kind of acts people feared spirits would perform on their one restless night back among the living. However, in the Gilded Age, the pranks were carried out by the living, and they became more than just harmless fun. As time went on and Halloween grew in popularity, these pranks became more elaborate and, crucially, increasingly destructive. In rural areas, Halloween pranksters often targeted farms and property. They might let cattle out of their enclosures, overturn wagons, or intentionally damage gardens. These acts were widespread enough to become a documented nuisance. But it was in the growing urban centers of the Gilded Age, where industry and population boomed, that the vandalism truly became the norm on Halloween night. Rabble-rousers and young men took to the streets. They set small fires, defaced buildings, and harassed passers-by. The booming urban centers of the Gilded Age struggled with this new form of holiday violence. Pittsburgh, being a booming urban center in that era, was definitely not immune to these types of hijinks. These destructive acts were so common and so problematic that they were often well documented in the local newspapers, like the Pittsburgh Dispatch. Newspapers across the country, particularly after the turn of the century when the Gilded Age was fading into the Progressive era, agitated for change. People feared the increasing intensity of the tricks, which could easily turn into vandalism, especially when other social tensions, like the massive wealth inequality we just discussed, were already present. Some Americans actively wanted to steer the focus of the Halloween holiday away from the dark, superstitious, and destructive pranks. There were even cities that considered banning Halloween entirely because it was becoming so dangerous. Columnists began urging people to eliminate the grotesque elements of the holiday and focus instead on fun games that wouldn't frighten anyone. The very origin of one of our most beloved traditions is tied directly to this era of pranking, the jack-o'-lantern. The earliest form of Halloween pranking is actually believed to be the origin of carving jack-o'-lanterns. For centuries, people had been making lanterns out of gourds and turnips to ward off evil spirits. But in the Gilded Age, this took a mischievous turn. Young boys would carve turnips with extremely ghoulish faces. They'd put a candle inside so the carved face would glow eerily in the dark. Then the boys would use these glowing, terrifying faces to frighten people. They would jump out at unsuspecting people in the dark, or sometimes they would tie strings to the turnips so that it looked like these glowing, disembodied faces were flying through the air, terrifying anyone who was unlucky enough to cross their path. While people in the Old World had used turnips and gourds, pumpkins, which are native to America, were much better suited and easier to carve. So carving pumpkins with sinister faces became a popular Halloween activity during the 1800s. People believed these scary, carved faces could frighten away any evil spirits lurking about on Halloween night, linking the tradition back to its ancient protective purpose, even as young boys used them for pranks. The jack-o'-lantern was truly solidified as a Halloween staple during this era. So, while the streets were full of mischief and potentially destructive pranks, many Gilded Age revelers chose to channel their spirit for the holiday into much more peaceful and, for the wealthy, much more extravagant celebrations. The high society celebration of the Gilded Age was the costume party. Costume parties became incredibly popular nationwide, especially among young adults. It's important to note that during this era, children were not yet the main intended audience for Halloween festivities. That would come later. For the wealthy, particularly in booming cities like New York, Halloween masquerade parties became highly fashionable affairs. Ladies and gentlemen would dress up in elegant or comical costumes, indulging in lavish feasts and high entertainment. For high society, these parties were a highlight of the year. They offered a perfect opportunity to mingle, show off extravagant gowns and suits, and of course, indulge in that delicious, expensive food and drink we talked about earlier, oysters and rare imported delicacies. These social happenings among the city's elite were so important that they were frequently reported in the newspapers. In Pittsburgh, for example, the social events among the Frick's neighbors on the wealthy and fashionable East End were often documented in the press. While we don't know if the famous Frick family themselves ever attended one of these Halloween parties, the sheer amount of coverage confirms that for the privileged class, Halloween was a great excuse for a sophisticated masked ball. People wore masks to conceal their identities, much like the pranksters, but for them, it was about adding glamour and intrigue to the social event, rather than hiding from the police or vengeful spirits. Beyond the extravagant balls of the wealthy and the dangerous pranking of the young men in the cities, certain traditional elements were enjoyed by people across all classes. These traditions often commemorated the harvest season, tying the holiday back to its ancient roots in Samhain, which celebrated the end of the harvest. One common traditional activity was bobbing for apples. Apples, turnips, and nuts, all autumnal produce, contributed greatly to the All-Hallows Eve atmosphere, with games, parties, and superstitions revolving around them. The Gilded Age also saw an increased fascination with death and the spiritual world. People were generally more receptive to the idea of the dead returning to Earth. Group seances and spiritualist mediums were wildly popular in the latter half of the 19th century. Sentimental items relating to death, known as memento mori, were fashionable. This cultural trend may have made people even more open to Halloween taking root in American life, as it aligned with their interest in blurring the line between the living and the dead. We also see the birth of commercial Halloween during the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age was defined by industry, factories, and railroad networks. This industrial era brought unprecedented economic prosperity to the nation, though unequally distributed, and innovative industrial processes meant more extra spending money was available at home. Because of this, the commercial delights of Halloween quickly became just as much a staple as the old traditions. Take candy corn, for instance. We associate it strongly with Halloween today. The Wunderl Candy Company of Philadelphia was the first to commercially produce candy corn in the 1880s, right in the heart of the Gilded Age. Candy corn was essentially a sugary nod to the autumnal harvest. By the turn of the century, the holiday was thoroughly commercialized. Companies like the Denison Manufacturing Company started publishing catalogs for Halloween decorations and stationery. Denison published its first catalog, which also included tips for holiday entertaining, in 1909, marking a formal step into mass-marketed Halloween goods. This commercialization meant that even the poor, if they could afford a few pennies, could participate in some way, though they certainly weren't throwing lavish masquerade balls. And finally, let's talk about the origin of the treat. Trick-or-treating is one of the most beloved modern Halloween customs, and its roots are complex, stretching back to the Gilded Age and even before. The tradition of children dressing up and going door to door for treats has uncertain origins, but scholars connect it to several practices. One connection is to the medieval practice of souling. During this time, the poor would go door to door, begging for food. In return for receiving food, they would promise to pray for the dead of the household. This practice later evolved in the Christianized holiday into giving out soul cakes, small confections given to the poor. Going a-souling became a child-friendly community activity where beggars sought alms or food. Another link is to the Scottish tradition of Guising, where children wore disguises and accepted gifts while going house to house on Halloween night. Even earlier, during the original Celtic Samhain, it was common to leave food out as an offering to the dead to appease them and prevent them from entering homes. Some view this as the earliest form of trick-or-treating, except instead of costumed children, it was meant for a potentially malicious spirit. Regardless of the precise origin, by the late 1800s in America, during the Gilded Age, the practice of going house to house for treats was widespread. It may have emerged out of harvest festivals, but it definitely gave children, both wealthy and poor, the opportunity to gather treats and engage in a bit of harmless mischief. However, the real moment that trick-or-treating became commonplace came much later, as a direct solution to the problem created during the Gilded Age, the destructive pranks. Remember how vandalism and violence were terrorizing the holiday in the early 1900s? After the Gilded Age faded, in the Progressive Era, neighborhood organizations in towns across the country started throwing large Halloween parties in community centers and town halls. They encouraged families and children to attend, trying to promote a safer, community-based family event. By the 1930s, beggars' nights were popular, and the concept of trick-or-treating rose in popularity. By the 1950s, trick-or-treating became commonplace. This shift was a conscious effort, a practical strategy for curbing vandalism. The idea was simple: bribe the children with candy to keep them from pulling destructive pranks on their neighbors. It worked. The Gilded Age was truly a turning point for Halloween. The period saw the holiday fully cemented in American culture, brought here by Irish and Scottish immigrants. It was a time when the ancient traditions of costume and food offerings merged with the extreme social conditions of America. For the wealthy, Halloween meant extravagant costume parties and mingling with the elite. Their excesses were evident even in their holiday fare. For the children on the streets, Halloween meant either getting treats, engaging in harvest games like bobbing for apples, or, often, engaging in increasingly destructive pranks. The jack-o'-lantern, born from those mischievous boys and their glowing turnips, became a lasting symbol. It was during this era that the tension between the trick, the anarchic vandalism of the working class against the backdrop of massive wealth, and the treat, the emerging commercialism and the later conscious effort to turn the holiday into a safe family event, came into sharp focus. These Gilded Age customs, the jack-o'-lanterns, the rise of candy corn, the elaborate parties, and the evolution of trick-or-treating, continue to shape the spooky fun celebrations we enjoy today. It reminds us that even the most fun holidays carry a long history, filled with old ghosts, new treats, and plenty of mischief. Thank you for joining us on this fascinating journey back to the Gilded Age. We'll see you next time.